Ladies and gentlemen, this is an extraordinary opportunity to meet a few people I don't know that you would have met here this year or last year. In fact, Cookie was here the last 3 years, giving something of an amazing presentation on this particular subject. And I hope she's thought of something new to say, but if not, you're going to get excited about what she does have to say. My name's Chip Moore. I want to welcome you on the behalf of the Los Angeles and Orange County Audio Society, who helps put these together. And let me now introduce Cookie, and then she will introduce her panel. Cookie Marenco was a pioneer of digital recording in the mid-'80s. And Cookie, I say that as a was. I rather say is a pioneer of digital recording since the 80s, and continues to experiment with new technologies, such as DSD, at her commercial recording facility located at Blue Coast Records in Silicon Valley. In 2007, she founded that particular company and then launched Downloads Now, a high-resolution digital audio distribution company that specializes in delivering DSD downloads, and I like to say worldwide, 58,000 and counting. I think that's a good number, or do you have a new number?
54. It's
54,
not,
that's
we'll be
close.
there by the end of the year.
Prior to starting her label, Cookie worked for Wyndham Hills. She was chief recording artist and engineer for Liquid Audio, worked on over 400 albums, which is enough for anybody, and currently records on 2-inch disc, 2-inch tape, as well as DSD. And now, here's Cookie.
Hi. Oh, thank you. How many of you were here last year? Oh, good. All right. How many of you know what we're talking about when we say the word provenance? Okay, a few. How many of you are familiar with Blue Coast Records? How many of you are listening to vinyl? And how many listening to CDs, SACDs? How many listening to FLAC? How many listening to DSD? Double DSD? MP3? Okay. I wanted to get an idea of who was here and the audience. Here's one. How many of you are listening on 1/4-inch tape? Oh my God. Paul, you're right. What? Used to. We still do, some of us. Great. What we're going to talk about today is provenance and what I call the 6 stages of production. Sometimes I refer to it as the 6 degrees of degradation. Yeah. And there's a lot of myth in the audiophile community about how a record gets made, and we have panelists here who are going to help explain the process. Because some people think we put 2 mics up and it magically is mixed as to what you hear coming out of your speakers, and it's just not really the case. And the first stage of production I call recording, multi-track process. We might have, anywhere from 2 to 100 tracks to deal with. Leslie's going to talk a little bit about that. The next stage, mixing, is where we take all those hundreds of tracks and make decisions onto left and right, compression, no compression, EQ, reverb, effects, overdubs, things like that. Third stage, mastering, when we're done with the mixing and we actually line it up so the songs, for instance, on a CD will play relatively the same level. We don't necessarily mix things at the same level. So a mastering stage is where you would put the space between the tunes, change the level. Some people actually do some additional EQ, reverb, compression, whatever you can do with 2 tracks. The fourth stage is, I call it the first 3 stages, the producer, the label, the artist is usually in control. And then after the first 3 stages, we don't know what happens. Production masters are made, and Paul and I can talk a little bit about that. He has some fascinating stories about what happens after we deliver a master. And you end up with a production copy. And who knows what that is. And then from the 4th stage to what I call the 5th stage is either the conversion process or the manufacturing. In CDs, it would be replication. Also, a lot of interesting things happen in manufacturing that's not in our control. And the 6th stage is the home listener and what you might do to it that we don't know about. So at this point, I'm going to briefly introduce and let them introduce themselves. Leslie Ann Jones from Skywalker Sound. Matty Karas, terrific journalist, working for Media Redefined. He handles the music column, and he's our resident skeptic, mainstream listener. He's going to be asking us questions the way you might ask questions. And this is his first audiophile show, so be gentle with him. And at the end, we have Paul Stubblebine, a wonderful mastering engineer, and now has the Tape Project, so he can talk about what happens with tape. And Paul and I have had some interesting experiences recently with the Paul Horn Masters, where we received production masters. And what happens with those masters that we then create either the downloads for you to listen to, or Sony might create a CD and other things. So anyway, at this point, I'd like Leslie to tell a little bit about herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I suppose the short story would be I've been a recording and mixing engineer for over 40 years. As I was telling Cookie, somebody told me that, and I find it hard to believe, but it's been quite a while, and I've been at Skywalker Sound as director of music recording and scoring for the last 18 years. And so I do a majority of my work at Skywalker, or at least a part of every project that I do is done there. I primarily do classical work. I also do record orchestras for film scores and mostly for video game scores. I still do quite a bit of pop and jazz multi-track work as well. But a lot of the work that I do actually is what we call direct to two-track. I might be using multiple mics, but I'm mixing at the same time, and the mix that I'm doing while I'm recording is the mix that you hear on the album. That happens in a lot of cases.
And Matty, Leslie, will you pass the mic?
Oh, sure, sorry.
That's okay.
I'm so average, I don't even have a microphone.
Matty and I got to know each other when I thanked him for actually pointing to an article on John Cage. And at the same time, he's a curator, music curator. I suggest everyone sign up for his newsletter. It's terrific. Every day you get a series of articles that range from electronic music to punk to, actually he's even featured some audiophile work, and talks about from the industry point of view and from the mainstream listener point of view. And Matty worked at MTV, and he's going to also kind of represent the metadata issue. Metadata issue, I usually put in the 5th stage, because I know a lot of you may have issues with metadata. I know because you write to me about your metadata issues. We all have metadata issues. Matty's going to talk a little bit about that. But anyway, Matty, tell us about your MTV days.
I was at MTV for about 10 years doing a lot of things. I came there as a journalist and news guy. I worked for MTV News, but then I helped MTV start up a thing called Urge, which was a very, very early streaming music site before Spotify, before all the stuff that's actually had some success. And we were a couple years too early. We were doing it before smartphones existed. But that's where I kind of learned the music programming online world, the metadata world, the licensing music, and all the nightmares that comes with that. And now curator, what I do now is kind of a fancy word for basically I read the internet so you don't have to.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is his intro is more interesting to me most of the time than a lot of the articles that are out there.
Thank you.
I really enjoy his writing, and we don't always agree. His boss kicked me off when I complained once about writing too favorably about Spotify. He unsubscribed me. So I wrote to Matty and I said, hey, you really mad at me too? And he said, nah, go ahead, sign up. Matty came to me at NAMM, where we entered the professional audio community, and we exposed them to high-resolution audio. And we did a panel for about 300 industry professionals, and it was pretty exciting, even though, you know, for us as Blue Coast Records, it didn't do much. But I think exposing to the professional audio community what's going on is going to make a better, it's going to give you a better listening experience.
And I should add, I'm probably the only person up here who does most of my listening either through Spotify or YouTube on my laptop. And I appreciate great audio, but that's not where I do most of my listening. And I think there's obviously a lot of me out there, and I'm interested in both worlds and how those worlds can work together.
Yeah, and that's why he's here. He represents the alternate view. I like that. Paul, you want to tell us about the tape project and some of your history?
Sure. By day, I'm a mild-mannered mastering man at a major metropolitan mastering lab. But when darkness falls, I step into a phone booth and come out as Analog Tape Man. I'm one of the co-founders of the Tape Project, a label been running 8 years now. We put out music on reel-to-reel tapes. When we started, nobody was doing this, although a few people had tried over the years. There was nobody doing it, and now there's about 15 or 16 labels releasing music on reel-to-reel tape. It's a side business for all of us, the three people running it. We all have other gigs, but we do this so that people who want that extra delicious listening experience can have a source for a good music on tape. In both of my jobs, the mastering and the tape project has brought me in contact with the issues of what are the sources and what are the pitfalls in getting the best possible quality source. So hopefully we will have a chance to talk about some of this as well. I've also done some recording and mixing and even live sound over the course of my career, but got trained in mastering when I was working for Columbia Records, so I worked within a big corporate situation. Columbia, now part of Sony BMG, but was part of the CBS broadcast networks at the time, and they trained me in mastering, and that's been my focus ever since. That would have been about 1973. I worked for them for 4 years, and I've been independent since. So I've been both inside and outside the corporate behemoth. Can I start with a little bit about, can I clarify some terminology? One thing that I think is very important is to clarify what we mean when we say master, because most people misunderstand this. Not just the audiophile community, where I see misunderstanding very often, but even in the record labels. Master means something we make copies from. And it's not necessarily the original master. It may be or it may not be. And it's important to know which you've got in your hand. When I was first cutting LPs, that's what, when I started in this business, that's how we made releases for you guys. We would be cutting lacquers and we would be running tape copies at the same time, which would be sent to the foreign affiliates, and they would be sent to the cassette plant, and those are masters because they're used to make copies. We made thousands of them, and so did all the major labels. And you might have someone offer you this tape and say, this is a master, and he's correct, but it's not the original master. And unless you know where it came from and how it was handled, you don't know what you have. That, in short, is provenance. Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking over the course of this hour about where things came from and how they're handled. Just be aware that the word master itself does not guarantee that we're talking about the original master. So you always need to ask the second question, where to come from and how it was handled.
That's a good point, because there was a period of time where even with the professionals, we would call the mix master.
Yeah.
That got very confusing when we were talking about a mixed master. That's just the mix. So I think most of us dropped the word master and just called it the mix.
Yeah.
Because it got confusing for us as professionals. You have a mix master, and then you have a master. It was too confusing. So I'm sure if the professionals are confused, it doesn't really translate well to you either. Paul, when we were doing those transfers, using the production masters, correct me when I'm using the wrong words, we were working on these Paul Horn tapes, originally recorded in 1968 in the Taj Mahal. It was a real honor and a privilege to be working with even the production master, and fascinating to me that the tapes that we were sent to, I don't know if any of you have them, but we now deliver them, came from 1981, and it happened that Paul knew the engineers on the project. He could read the back and started telling me stories that I wasn't aware of, because back in 1981, for instance, they maybe weren't as critical about transferring tapes. People don't know what's going to be a legacy recording, what's going to last a lifetime, what should they be concerned with. And so at that time, they're just running off copies somewhat, I don't want to say carelessly, but not really taking care. Paul, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I said that I worked in Columbia Records. I was working in San Francisco, which was one of the small outpost studios, but in New York, they had a large studio complex with 3 or 4 studios, about 6 mixing rooms. They would mix the record in a different control room than the recording studios, and then they had a bunch of mastering cubicles, and they literally were cubicles, very small places where and they worked 2 shifts. It was a union shop, and it existed for the convenience of the label, because they had to manage an awful lot of catalog all the time. And my experience was that some of the guys that didn't really care an awful lot anymore, but they still had a guaranteed job, one of the better ones available to them, that's who was working the night shift, and they would come in, and the studio manager would have a pile of work orders for them and the originals that they had to copy, and they would just do tape copies for 8 hours. I don't know that they were doing it as carefully as it's possible. I would love to think that every single person in our industry that gets their hands on a master and has to do some transfer with it does it the absolute best that he can, but I can't say that truthfully, because I don't think it's the case. We also were in the era there where the tape was starting to get worse. A lot of these were made on the Ampex 456, the poster boy for Sticky Shed, and which actually changed its sonic character in storage to my ear. They started sounding soggier and soggier the longer between the day it was recorded and the day you played it back. But in any case, it was a production environment. environment, a factory type of environment, that they had to get all this stuff done. They had release dates in the foreign territories, and they'd worn out a master at the cassette plant and various things, and they just had to get them out. So the tapes Cookie's talking about were field recordings done on a Nagra, I believe, and at some time or another, that wouldn't be much good for the record label, because they don't have machines that play the Nagra proprietary curve. It's much easier for them to have something that's an NAB curve. That's what they were all using at the time, and to be able to send it into the mastering cubicle to cut LPs. So they made an EQ copy probably to start with, and from that they made these production copies, probably what we got. So yeah, I filled out enough of these tape box labels myself that I could discern what it was. It looked like night shift jobs.
Yeah. Anyway, it was fascinating to have Paul there at the session and talk about this. Leslie, I noticed you're writing down the words master. Would you like to comment on it? No? Okay.
No, I was just writing down some notes, Paul mentioned EQ copy, and people might not know what that really is, but I mean, I actually got started, my first job in a studio was making tape copies, was taking what were EQ copies that were made in the mastering room that Paul and his forebears did, that had all the equalization, all the compression, anything that was done at the same time as a disc was being made. The tape copy contained all of that information, so that the tape could be shipped to, as Paul said, foreign affiliates, and that they would, their records then, they would not have to reinvent the wheel. Their records would sound the same, theoretically, as the records that were released in the U.S. Unfortunately, in many cases, EQ copies are all that the labels have left. They don't have the original masters, so we're dealing with production masters now that are the only copies that we have that really have things in them that were there for vinyl. And of course, vinyl has different needs than other formats do, particularly on the low end. So in fact, Paul and I were talking last night, I think, about whether, if that's all you had was an EQ master, would it be better to take that and remaster it so that it sounds more like what we're used to hearing now, rather than just take it as it's, because it's the big EQ master, and, realize, well, it was made for vinyl, and it would sound fine if it went for vinyl, but it's not going to sound fine for CD or DSD or high res or anything else. So that's what an EQ copy is.
Yeah, and it's a good time to point out what a safety copy is, because it's something different. We're now talking about the tape era again. Safety copy was considered something that was as identical as we could make it to the master, so that you could cut it into the master. If you damaged a few inches of your master tape, that you could just cut in a small section. So it's the same level, the same EQ, it's just a flat copy. Sometimes when you go searching in the vaults and you can't find the original, you find production copies, which is EQ copies, that contain all the little moves that were made in mastering, and a flat copy or a safety copy. And often the safety copy is the one you want, that you're closer to the original master and it hasn't been squeezed into a narrower package, for which you sometimes have to do for the LP, for instance. And it's a better source then for moving forward into a modern high-res format, PCM, DSD, or analog tape.
So Leslie, when you're, do you want to describe a little bit of the multi-track process for us? Like what might be the difference between a classical recording and a modern day pop recording, for instance?
Well,
there's what formats you record to?
Yeah, there's a big difference. I was just thinking, let me just cut to the end of the hour and say the reason that this is important to all of you is because you need to know what you're paying for. If you are going to spend $25 for a high-res product, you need to know where it came from. And that's really the discussion we're all having to try and enlighten you on what the importance is of what those different terminologies are. So when you go to a site, many sites now, unless it's a big thing like, a Blue Note release or something like that, where they're sitting talking about the mastering engineer and where the tapes came from, you can go to any of those sites and you don't know where the tapes came from. So it's important for you to understand that so that you are getting your money's worth and that you know what it is that you're getting. And for us making modern records now, file management is just the bane of my existence because it's not like it was when, Paul and I met at the former CBS studios and Paul would master my records, and it wasn't like that where you only had to worry about reading somebody's legible handwriting. Now you can have 4 or 5 different files of the same tune, and if somebody isn't careful about how they title them, you won't know which is the right one except for the date. Or you make a change and the artist decides that the change is not the change they want, you go back to the original. Unless you highlight it or put a color on it or put a big star on it or say use this and don't use the others, it gets to some place where you aren't even at and they don't know which one to use, they don't know which vocal to use. It's very confusing and frustrating.
We'll receive digital file tracks, even a simple recording of 20 tracks where a Pro Tool file won't be stored correctly and we don't know which vocal to use, and it's not been indicated, and we're resurrecting something that's 5, 7, 10 years old. You can imagine after a while, after a period of time when we're all dead, is anybody going to really know? I had the experience with my Blue Coast Collection 1 where we were moving so fast. Actually, I think we were doing some of the final mixes up at Skywalker, and at the time, I knew which ones we were using of the different mastered versions, and then 10 years later, I'm looking at these half-inch tapes wondering myself. I had to listen to every one and go through, and it's lucky I'm still alive.
Yeah.
Because I had wildly different mixes, and I thought, and I usually am on it. I don't even know what happened. So it's really easy to lose track of what you're working on.
Well, and if it's difficult for those of us that are doing most of the work ourselves, imagine if you're working on a modern Adele record or a Lady Gaga record or a contemporary record where there are 13 engineers, 15 producers, a bunch of composers that are all doing their own work in their own studios and then handing their beats over to somebody else. There's dozens and dozens of people working on modern records, which makes that kind of file management very difficult to deal with, and which is also why it's very hard to find a lot of modern records that are high res, because there's so many people working on them that it's much more important to have file transfers be very fast than it is to have the quality be very high, because you're transferring files back and forth. It's much easier doing the records that we do, where we're the only ones responsible for it. But even so, I'll get to the mastering room and I'll look at my thing and I'll go, okay, what's the difference between Alt 1 and Alt 2? Right. I spent 2 hours the other day, and this is a piano record, trying to figure out what the difference was between Alt 1 and Alt 2. It was stupid. But in my work as an engineer, we're doing everything at 2496. We have been using Pro Tools for a number of years. Used to use outboard converters. Now we have the new HDX with Pro Tools that sounds really good. And we do that. I have a big analog console that I mix from, so I can mix to any format. I just recorded the Colorado Symphony Orchestra at 2496 mix and mixed it to 192 24-bit. So I mixed it at the highest rate I could because I couldn't record it at a high rate. And so that's, but there's a big difference between kind of the modern records and those kinds of records.
I wanted to mention too, Leslie was one of the first engineers, professional engineers, to contact us about what we were doing with Downloads Now and offer some of the recordings she had been making up at Skywalker. And then Leslie's very high up at the Recording Academy. You all know about the Grammys and NARAS. And she felt, like I did, that we needed to have a discussion within the professional audio community. We were all on a conversation with, 20 engineers one day, wanting to know about the metadata questions. How hard is it to start? And when you want the right metadata, it's got to start at the multi-track process from the beginning. And there's very few engineers who are even taking the correct names of who was on the record, who was performing it, let alone the formats. And what came up that was fascinating to me is, as we were as a professional community trying to pull this together, I remember Andrew Sheps said, wait a minute, you don't know how hard it is. Andrew Sheps mixed Adele and a number of other pop recordings that you might have at home. He's a terrific engineer, but he gets 200 or 300 tracks recorded from maybe 20 different engineers with an overdub done in Germany and then symphony orchestra in London and Adele's vocal somewhere else. And they're not on all the same formats. You might have one format done at 9624 and something else come in at 44 116-bit because it's the default. And when he brought this up, I wasn't even really aware of the challenges and the frustrations a professional audio engineer encounters. Anyway, it was fascinating to me. I don't know if Leslie had any reaction to that, but I wanted at this point to ask Matty, who might have do you have any questions about what we're doing?
I have a question about what you just said about metadata, which is, whose job is it to make sure the metadata actually, is it at a given label, your label, whose job is that to make sure that it's what it needs to be, that the correct information is on a file?
Well, funny enough, at Blue Coast, we keep notes. So we actually have a pretty accurate record. I think the difficulty comes as Downloads Now. You guys may be familiar with Downloads Now. The difference is Downloads Now, we had other labels wanting to use our service, our platform for distribution. Like some of the labels that Leslie was working with. And is this being recorded anywhere? Okay, I'll bring this up. Once it left, we did a recording with an a cappella group, Chanticleer. It was a terrific recording, and Leslie suggested we contact them and put it out. She had done the recording. And so we contacted them. They were thrilled. And Leslie, I don't know if I ever told you this, but after the mastering process, some of the things we got were like 30 seconds of blank silence and in front of the music, and we knew this wasn't right. And when we went to look for the metadata, we noticed that what was at Amazon.com, for instance, wasn't the same as what was on the back of the album cover. I don't know if that was the exact translation, but what we got was different information. So we decided to go to the record label and say, hey, what's up? And it takes weeks and weeks and weeks of pressure, and then the record label actually is not a very good resource because they never ask who was on the record, who engineered it, who was the assistant getting coffee.
How big a label are you talking about?
This is a very small label.
And that's part of the...
Right.
That's part of the problem is the major record labels are trying to do a much better job of this because in many cases they're dealing with union sessions, so people have to get paid after the fact. Many of the producers and engineers are in royalty positions, so they get paid after the fact. So the labels really need to know who actually performed on it, who the composers were, what the splits are between between the composers. There's a myriad of things that happen regarding the people that actually make money after the fact, that with independent labels, like Blue Coast, most of the records I do are independent, that kind of stuff doesn't really come into play so much because, first of all, nobody's making any money on the record, and they're making most of their money on live performances. But I will say that the record companies are doing a really great job now of transferring all of their multi-tracks to digital formats and taking scans of the boxes.
Really?
And scans of the track sheets. Yeah, I did a remix project for a Mercedes car that involved surround sound, and it had a bunch of pop things on it, and everything we got from the major labels was, it's actually how we would do it at Skywalker when we're doing transfers, where we take copies of the box labels, the spine, any pieces of paper on the inside, so that what you get, you feel like you're actually working from the multi-track, even though you're working from a digital record. But that's one of the reasons the Recording Academy actually is so big on this whole metadata question. You asked whose responsibility it was. It really falls with whatever studio you're working in. So I know the producers and engineers wing is working now on some form that can kind of go at the studio, so that the producer's responsibility is to fill it out, who played on it, what date they played on it, who was the assistant engineer, all those kinds of things. That all ends up going to the record company. It's not going to be easy to make that happen, but if enough self-interested producers and engineers realize that the reason they're going to get paid is because they're going to write their name on a sheet of paper, it'll happen.
Can I just...
Yeah.
That's great to hear that that's happening. And I think there's metadata is used in a couple of different ways. And one way, making sure that everyone is paid is obviously crucial, and that's awesome. But also, as a consumer, metadata tells me who played on this session, who played on this song, who did that violin part, who played that drum part. And it seems to me that labels are not doing such a good job on that end. And I don't know, and I've always wondered if there's a need to codify and coordinate among different formats and labels and services, so that it seems that there's probably 8,000 different ways that metadata gets sent to different...
But where are you looking for that? Are you looking for it on Spotify when you're on your headphones, or are you looking for it...
I would love to. I can't on Spotify.
Yeah.
I wish I could, but I'm looking if I buy something from iTunes, or if I buy something from a different...
Right.
from Amazon or anywhere.
Well, and that's the problem, because with iTunes or any of those services, all you're getting is all you're really getting is the cover. You're not getting any other information. You're not getting the inside jacket. You're not getting a PDF. In many cases, you probably can't even go to the artist's website and have them put a PDF, which would be great if artists would do, actually. They would just provide the PDF of what you would buy if you were buying the CD that would have all that information, and then you would know who played on what track. So it's more, I think, than just a record company. It's an issue of realizing that people want this information. And not to bring up the Recording Academy again, but we started something called Give the Fans Credit, which was the fans, actually, and if you go to givethefanscredit.com, it's the fans writing to record labels saying, we want this information. We want these credits.
I think we live in a world now where, liner notes don't exist anymore. People don't buy mostly CDs with little pull-out packages or albums with jackets. They buy files. And I think some of the files are the new, metadata is the new record label, record jacket or CD. And I'd love to see the industry figure out a way to make that, to really bring that to life, so that as an end consumer, I can listen to a random track and, hey, who wrote that song? Who played that part? Where was it recorded, et cetera, et cetera.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was thinking, isn't for us consumers to get CDs or downloads or whatever, there's iTunes, I think one other, the big database that you get when you try to
voice note. Yeah, and you know what's interesting? When I was involved with MP3 delivery back in 1997, we were one of the first download companies with liquid audio. And at that time, Amazon and Barnes & Noble, interestingly enough, used to have a lot more metadata back then. In fact, I remember them contacting us with every record, and somebody literally typed it in. But then it became automated. There was too many albums in the system, and you've noticed it's gone way down.
I used to be a person who typed in metadata. That was one of my first jobs.
Really?
I worked at a company called Muse.
Muse, I remember them.
I sat there and copied CD jackets for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
But I want to bring this all back to, you talked about provenance. And provenance matters obviously to someone who's buying a high-res recording. If they're spending $40 for a CD, they want to make sure that that's a good master, good everything. I go to Spotify, and if I'm listening to an old John Coltrane record, or an old Chuck Berry record, and there could be 17 different copies in Spotify or Rhapsody from 17 different sources, and I have absolutely no way of knowing what the provenance of that is. And I think provenance matters for people like me as much as it matters for people spending $40 for
Wow,
that
that's
CD.
fascinating. I'm not a Spotify listener, so I didn't actually realize that was going on.
Well, that probably comes from so many, that probably comes from so many reissues. I mean, if you take something really popular like, Freddie Freeloader from, Miles Davis or something, that's going to show up on 30 records because of all the various compilations, and so Spotify probably has that many versions of the same thing just because of all the albums that they have.
Albums that have started to fall out of copyright.
Yes.
Yeah, I got on Spotify when it first became available in this country, and I found that it was great to be able to look up so much music from the artists I wanted to hear, but most of it was not the original recording. It was some live recording. They were just trying to get their library full at that time. I haven't been listening to it lately. I don't know what it's like, but in the beginning, you would think you were getting what you were looking for, and what you were getting was an alternative version. And again, no information to tell you. You just had to start listening and go, oh, no, not it.
Yeah.
So I think it would make the Spotify experience, the streaming experience, a lot more desirable for people if they could find out what it was that they were going to be getting.
Question?
There are some sites that help you get closer to the music. Phono folks, for instance, maybe HP tracks and stuff. They can add value by doing this research and locating the most authentic or earliest version of a piece of music, the one that has least volume compression, or not made from a third-generation tape or something. And that's very hard to find.
It is, and I think you'll only see it from them if you start requesting it, if the whole listener community starts requesting it. Because it's not really in the best interest of their business model to tell you. They want to get their library full too, and they are willing to take anything right now that meets their definition of high res. They will not put up upsampled recordings because they've gotten burned on that. But beyond that, they're not really interested in giving you the background on the recordings. They just want you to know it's 9624 and you'll pay their 9624 price. But honestly, there's different quality levels at 9624, and maybe they shouldn't all be the same price. The people who've done a very careful job in trying to create a sublime listening experience for you after you've downloaded it, maybe that's worth a little more than a slapdash transfer off of a secondary source. But it won't happen until you ask for it. That's why we're really having this panel, honestly.
Where 4460 sounds better than
Yeah.
This is somebody who's saying that they've had experiences where the 44116 sounds better than something that's higher res, and it could be the fact that whatever the higher res version is came from something that was not the same source that the 44116 came from.
And
which is why it's important to get get that information. I mean, in the case of Spotify, if you're listening on your computer, many cases, you can have that little circle with an eye that is for more information, and you can click on that. It would be very simple to do. But as Paul says, unless people demand that, unless they say that we want that information, it's not going to happen, because the record companies have the information and they can provide it. But unless there's some special marketing thing like there was with the whole Blue Note release on HD tracks, where it was the cover story on the homepage of HD tracks, and they talked about the whole mastering process, they're not going to make a big push on that, but they can certainly get the information. And if they know you're not going to buy something from them unless you know where it came from, then that's a big incentive for them to get that.
And what, go ahead.
Metadata doesn't necessarily tie all the way back to the provenance, so much so that there's now a service called Provenance, which is a full service per month, which provides you what am I listening to now? Okay, let me click to find more detail about what was recording engineer, and then click to more detail about where it was recorded.
What's it called?
It's called Ruin? Oh, ROON. I've heard about them. Yeah, and I'm wondering where they get their information from. Because it's, there's a number of allmusic.com and some other sites where, you know, as a label you provide information, but sometimes I see things on there that I've recorded and I don't know where they're getting the information from. You know, and one other thing I wanted to mention, because we haven't talked about it much and it's probably a little known secret, not all conversions are the same. We do the conversions. We test the converters. And you can get a different sounding converter. I'm almost at the point where I can tell where somebody's using J River converter, and I know who they are, and you know, versus a Weiss, versus the other conversion formats or software out there. So just to be aware, I think at some point that's going to be an issue too. What converters are you using to convert the files for, you know, for selling to you guys?
Really, and if a download site is offering it in several formats, DSD and PCM, I'd like to know what the original one is. I just like to listen to it in the original format rather than converted. If I want to listen to DSD, I'd like to listen to it as DSD. I've never been that happy with a conversion either direction between PCM and DSD. So how about just full disclosure?
Yeah.
Let the customer make their choice.
Yeah. And there was another question over here.
A while back, we suggested that you could take some of these tapes, I guess sub-masters generated during mastering process, sent to other locations, for instance, perhaps re-EQ them and use them and generate as the input for encoding for 2496 and so forth. But you can re-EQ them to fix the spectral balance, but you can't get rid of the volume compression. Not reliable. That seems to be the case in some of the 2496s we're saying there. Have 6, 8 dB additional volume compression on it. Perhaps that's what you're hearing. I know that's what I hear.
Well,
Very let down.
He's talking about the using tape masters that were that have volume compression on them, and that if you use those, even if you remaster from that as the source, it's hard to get rid of the compression on them. But frankly, and I'm sorry because Paul was going to say something, but I'll just say that to me, in many cases, that's the sound of the record. So you may not want to get rid of that, because that is whatever you loved about that record 30 years ago, that's what you loved about the record. And to try and make it pristine and try and take that sound out of it, I think would not be where you would want to go. I think you would want to have the sound of the record in a modern format that sounds as great as it can be, but not lose the essence of what it is that made you fall in love with that record.
Although, you know what, I wanted to point something out is I think that's true for older records. In newer records, they're often so over-compressed that I've wanted to go and get the multi-tracks and let me do an audiophile remix with allowing more of the dynamics to exist. I think there's going to actually be a small market like there are with DJs to remix songs. We're going to have our own audiophile remixes. Give me the multi-tracks and let us remix it before a lot of other things have happened to it. I know we've been requesting multi-tracks, and even if they're stereo pairs of stem mixes, we call them, even that could help us get a better sound, or at least what we think is a better sound. Not everybody may agree, but let 5 different engineers mix it to their own taste. We're going to have to wind down right now. Does anybody?
Paul was going to say something about the compression though, before I so rudely interrupted him.
Well, I was just going to say that we sometimes wind up working from production masters because that's all that's left. But when we can work from the original master, we prefer to. However, when I get something that's an iconic recording and I have the original master, I familiarize myself with the released versions because that does, in a certain sense, embody the intent of the artist and the producer. And I may not remaster it to be identical. I'm remastering for a new format, and maybe the new format is a wider window than the original format was. But as Leslie points out, sometimes the treatments that were used, compression and other things, is part of what they were trying to create. And I don't like to work against the intent of the original artist and producer.
When I tell you that I once had the fortunate task of taking Motown 8-tracks, meaning they were recorded on 8-track machines. And this was when the Motown Cafe was opening in New York. And so my job was to take these and to make tracks, because the waiters and waitresses at the Motown Cafe in New York were going to be singing live to these tracks. When I tell you that you could put 8 faders up like this, and that's how the record sounded, it was astounding to me. And I had so much more respect for the quality of engineering then, and how little needed to be done to it. You literally could put 8 faders like this all in a row, and the record that you heard on the radio, that's what it sounded like. And it was just fantastic.
Well, I want to thank the panelists for coming, and thank you for being here, and we'll be available outside if you want to ask more questions. Thank you. Good job.